There's something people never warn you about success. It doesn't protect you from the people who were supposed to love you first. My name is Diana, and by the time I was 32, I had built a $45 million fashion brand from a $200 sewing machine in my college apartment. But none of that mattered the night my brothers stood in front of our entire family, aunts, uncles, my grandmother in her best Sunday dress, and called me a fraud. And my mother nodded. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. Not the anger, the silence after. I had been watching the live stream from my office in Chicago when I saw it. My brother had agreed to a feature interview with a regional business magazine, a puff piece, I assumed, about the family. Something harmless. Instead, I watched him lean back in his leather chair, straighten his cufflinks, and spend 40 minutes rewriting history. He talked about our mother's sacrifices. He talked about family values. He talked about how he had stepped in to give the brand its direction, its identity, its soul. He said the words I built 11 times. I counted. My assistant Maya knocked on my glass door. She had seen it too. She didn't say anything. She just set a cup of coffee on my desk and quietly closed the door behind her. I sat there for a long time after the stream ended. The city below me moved like it always did, indifferent, enormous, relentless. I had started Laine Studio in that apartment with nothing but a sketchbook and a credit card I was terrified to use. I had sewn the first 40 samples myself. I had cold emailed buyers for 3 years before anyone took a meeting. I had done all of it while my brother was living in Scottsdale, working a sales job he quit every 8 months, telling anyone who would listen that he had big plans. He moved back to Chicago 2 years ago. I had given him a role in operations out of obligation, out of guilt. Really, the specific guilt that comes from being the one in the family who made it. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself family was family. I picked up my phone and called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, the way it always was when she didn't know I was upset. I told her I saw the interview. I told her calmly, the way you speak when you're holding something very heavy and you don't want to drop it in public. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he'd worked hard this past year. She said I needed to understand his perspective. She said I had always been the strong one, that I didn't need the recognition the way he did. I have replayed that sentence many times since. You don't need it the way he does. As if my need for my own name to be attached to my own work was a luxury. As if building something from nothing and watching someone else take credit for it was just one of the small inconveniences of being capable. I told her I'd talk to her later. I ended the call. I didn't throw anything. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and pulled up every financial document, every founding contract, every original design patent registered under Laine Studio, all of them under my name, my LLC, my signature. I was going to need all of it. The dinner my mother arranged that weekend was meant to smooth things over. That was how she operated a round table, a home-cooked meal, the implicit pressure of food and family to keep everyone from saying what they actually meant. My brother arrived in a new jacket. He kissed my mother on the cheek and shook hands with our uncle like a man who had just closed a deal. He barely looked at me when he sat down. We made it through the salad before I said anything. I told him I watched the interview. I said it the same way you'd mention the weather, flat, conversational, impossible to deflect. He smiled. He actually smiled. He said the magazine needed a narrative, that I knew how media worked, that it was just positioning. I asked him what exactly he thought he had positioned himself as. He set down his fork. He said I needed to be more flexible. He said the brand needed a face that was approachable, his word, and that my personality had always been a lot for certain rooms. My grandmother looked at her plate. My uncle cleared his throat. My mother reached over and touched my brother's arm like she was steadying him. Not me. Him. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not broke shifted, like a fault line that had been building pressure for years, finally deciding which way it was going to move. I folded my napkin. I placed it beside my plate. I told them both that I understood. I told my brother I hoped the interview served him well. Then I stood up, said goodnight to my grandmother, and left. I did not let them see my hands shaking. In my car, I sat in the dark for a few minutes. My phone lit up with a text from my best friend and head of PR, Jade. She'd seen social media clips from the interview circulating in fashion industry circles. People were tagging my brother. People were congratulating him. One editor I had personally pitched for 3 years had commented a string of fire emojis under his photo. Jade's text said, "We need to talk tonight. This is getting ahead of us." I drove to her apartment and we sat at her kitchen table until 1 a.m. She laid it out plainly the way only someone who loves you and works for you at the same time can. My brother hadn't just done an interview. He had been quietly building relationships with two of our key wholesale buyers over the past 4 months. He had been attending meetings I hadn't scheduled him for. He had been introducing himself as co-founder. I hadn't known any of it. I asked her how long she had known. She looked at me steadily and said she had suspected for 6 weeks, but she hadn't wanted to bring me something she couldn't prove. Now she could prove it. She slid a folder across the table. I read through it slowly. Emails forwarded from a buyer contact of hers. Meeting notes. A proposal written on Laine Studio letterhead, with my brother's name at the top, sent to a private equity firm I had never heard of. The proposal described Laine Studio as a family-operated brand seeking new leadership infrastructure. It suggested that the current structure was overly centralized and that growth had been limited by the founder's operational style. I read that sentence 3 times. Limited by the founder's operational style. I was the founder. I was the one who had taken this brand from $200 to $45 million, and my brother had written a document on my company's letterhead, with my company's name suggesting to outside investors that I was the problem. I closed the folder. I told Jade I needed a week. She nodded. She poured us both another cup of coffee. She said, "Whatever you're thinking, I'm in." I spent that week being very quiet and very busy. The first thing I did was call my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had handled my IP filings since the beginning. I walked her through everything: the proposal, the buyer meetings, the letterhead. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said 3 words. "He overplayed it." She explained. My brother had no ownership stake in Laine Studio. He had no equity, no founding agreement, no intellectual property rights. He was an operations manager, a title I had given him, a salary I paid, a role that existed entirely at my discretion. The proposal he had sent to the private equity firm was not just misleading, it was potentially actionable. He had represented himself as having authority he did not possess, using brand assets, the letterhead, the name, the logo without authorization. I asked her what my options were. She said we could send a formal cease and desist to the PE firm, clarifying his actual role. We could terminate his employment. We could pursue damages if the misrepresentation had caused measurable harm to existing business relationships. I said I needed to think about timing. She said, "Don't wait too long. If he gets a term sheet from that firm, it gets messier." I drove home and stood at my apartment window for a long time looking at the lake. I thought about my brother at 12, teaching me to ride a bike in a parking lot, because my father had already left, and my mother was working doubles. I thought about how I had meant to give him something real by bringing him in. I thought about how meaning well had not been enough to make it right. Then I thought about the $45 million and every single hour it had cost me. And I made my decision. The annual Laine Studio Buyer Preview, an event I had hosted every year since the brand's 4th year, was scheduled for the following Thursday. It was the one event where every key wholesale partner, press contact, and industry relationship came together under one roof. My brother had been CC'd on the planning emails. He believed he was co-hosting. I removed his name from the program the night before. He showed up the morning of the event in a new suit. He walked through the venue like he owned it, shaking hands, laughing easily, positioning himself near the entrance where the cameras would catch him greeting guests. I watched him from across the room. Jade appeared at my side. She said, "Ready?" I said yes. The program opened with a short film, something we produced every year, a behind-the-scenes look at the collection's development. This year, I had quietly re-edited it. Every frame featured original footage, me at 23 at my sewing machine, the first sample run, the first retail meeting, sketches in my handwriting from the very beginning. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. When the lights came up, I walked to the front of the room. I spoke for about 12 minutes. I thanked our buyers, our press partners, our production team. I talked about where Laine Studio started and where it was going. I talked about the values that had defined every collection: precision, intention, and accountability. I did not mention my brother by name. I didn't need to. I watched his face as I spoke. I watched the moment he understood what was happening. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, just a simple, public, irrefutable re-establishment of record. The room was full of people who mattered, and every one of them was watching me stand at the front of my own company and claim it clearly. After the program, He found me near the back of the venue. His voice was low and tight. He said I had embarrassed him. I looked at him calmly. I said he had done that interview without telling me. I said he had sent a proposal to a private equity firm using my letterhead without my knowledge or consent. I said my attorney was aware of both. The color left his face. I told him I wasn't going to make a scene. I told him he had until Monday morning to come in and formally resign, or Patricia would be sending letters to the PE firm and to our buyers clarifying the full scope of what he had represented to them. I told him the choice was entirely his. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he walked out. My mother called me that night. Her voice was different this time, not warm, not smoothing things over. She was upset in the way she got when she felt events had moved without her permission. She said I had humiliated him. I said he had tried to sell my company without telling me. She went quiet. Then she said she had always worried I cared more about the business than about family. I had been waiting for that sentence my whole life without knowing it. It landed with a strange kind of lightness, like something I had been bracing for had finally arrived, and I could put my arms down. I told her I loved her. I told her that loving her did not mean I would let her use that love to make me smaller. I told her that the business was not separate from me. It was something I had made, and it deserved the same protection any mother would give something she had built from nothing. She didn't respond to that. I said goodnight and I meant it. My brother resigned by email on Sunday evening. It was 4 sentences. No apology. Patricia sent the clarifying letters Monday morning. The PE firm responded within 24 hours. They withdrew from any further discussion. Our 2 key buyers, once informed of the situation, reaffirmed their existing contracts directly with me. The week after that was quiet in the way that follows a storm, not peaceful exactly, but still. I walked through the Laine Studio space on a Tuesday morning, past the sample racks and the mood boards and the pattern tables, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I had almost lost, not because my brother had almost taken it, but because I had let myself believe that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping what I had built. They are not the same thing. I know that now. Jade stopped by my office that afternoon and sat across from me without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "You know the industry is talking?" I asked her what they were saying. She smiled a little. That Laine Studio has a very clear point of view about who runs Laine Studio. I thought about that for a while after she left. My grandmother called me that same evening. She was the only one from that dinner table who reached out. She didn't talk about my brother. She didn't talk about my mother. She asked how I was sleeping, whether I was eating, whether the studio was warm enough in winter because she always worried about the cold in Chicago. I told her I was fine. I told her the studio had good heat. She said, "You always were the one who knew what things were worth." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just held on to it. A few weeks later, I was contacted by a business school, not the one my brother had attended. Not anyone connected to any of this, asking if I would speak at their entrepreneurship symposium. The topic they suggested was building something that lasts when the people around you don't believe it will. I accepted. I stood at that podium in front of 200 students, and I said the thing I wish someone had told me at 23. The people who underestimate you are not always strangers. Sometimes they are people who watched you struggle and decided that the struggle was the whole story. They missed the part where you kept going anyway. They missed the part where the struggling was the training. You do not owe anyone a smaller version of what you built. You do not owe silence to people who would use your silence to rewrite the record. And you do not have to choose between loving your family and protecting what you made. But if someone forces that choice, know that protecting your work is not the same as abandoning the people you love. It is refusing to let love be used as a lever against your own life. I still think about the moment my mother said I didn't need recognition the way my brother did. I think about it not with bitterness anymore, but with something closer to clarity. She was wrong, but she believed she was being kind. Those 2 things can both be true. Laine Studio is mine. It always was. That has not changed. What changed is that I stopped being quiet about it. If you've ever had someone take credit for something you built, drop a 1 in the comments. Or tell me where you're watching from. I want to hear your story. Because if this hit close to home, you're not alone, and you don't have to stay quiet about it either. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Real, raw, and told the way they actually happened.